Since I've been in Lund, I've been told that legend holds that back when this building really was the king's house, Samuel Pufendorf may have sat in its library and written his masterpiece, The Law of Nature and of Nations. And I've also been told that the ghost of Pufendorf still haunts these hallways. We may be able to find out the truth of this matter today, because I think it's surely true that if anything can summon the ghost of a long-dead philosopher, it's hearing a bunch of philosophers talk about his work. And that's what I'm about to do, because I'm not the first philosopher to undertake an account of the origin of one of the entities that we deal with in moral philosophy. Chapter 1 of Pufendorf's book, The Law of Nature and of Nations, is entitled On the Origin and Variety of Moral Entities. Moral entities include rights, obligations, normative powers, offices, and persons themselves. Pufendorf says, these passages are on your handout, as the original way of producing physical entities is creation, so the way in which moral entities are produced can scarcely be better expressed than by the word imposition. For they don't arise out of the intrinsic nature of the physical properties of things, but they're superadded at the will of intelligent entities to things already existent and physically complete. Pufendorf also tells us how to go about creating moral entities. We do it by making laws. It's by making laws that we transform a piece of land into a piece of property, an action into an obligation, a human being into a person, that is someone with rights and obligations, and a person into a king with the specific powers of office. Pufendorf is aware of the worry that if moral entities are the creation of legislation, they must be arbitrary. And his answer is essentially the same as the one I gave in my first lecture when I explained why furniture and justice, even though they are creations, are not arbitrary. Pufendorf says, although moral entities owe their origin to imposition, and for that reason are not in any absolute sense necessary, yet they have not arisen in such a loose and general manner that scientific knowledge about them is on that account uncertain. The very condition of man demanded the institution of most of them. Now, as we've already seen, Pufendorf rejects the notion of the good in favor of the notion of good for. But good for is not among Pufendorf's moral entities. Instead, it guides their creation. Pufendorf himself affirms this. After explaining that actions considered simply as physical motions are neither right nor wrong in themselves, he says, it should be carefully noted that this indifference of physical motion in the actions of men is maintained by us only in respect to morality. For otherwise, the actions that are prescribed by the law of nature do have the native power to produce an effect, good and useful to mankind, while actions similarly forbidden produce a contrary effect. But this natural goodness and evil does by no means constitute an action in the field of morals. By the law of nature, Pufendorf here, of course, means the moral law. So his point is that the actions that are prescribed by morality are useful to humankind. He asserts that we would often do the things that morality requires of us in view of their utility, even if they were not required. But it's not their utility that makes them obligatory. It's the fact that they're prescribed by law. Now, I mention all this because there's a theoretical structure here that we find in a number of early modern moral theories. Morality arises when something that is naturally good or useful has a moral or normative property imposed upon it. In Pufendorf's own theory, which he derives from Hobbes, actions that are useful because they promote social life become obligatory when God or a sovereign prescribes them by law. In Hutcheson's theory, benevolent motives become virtuous when the moral sense approves of them. In Hume's theory, motivational patterns that are useful or agreeable to a person himself or to others become moral motives when they are approved from an impartial point of view. So in all these theories, we find something naturally good or useful becomes moral when a moral attribute is imposed on it. Now, of course, in order to complete any of these stories, we then have to say something about the normative status of whatever it is that confers the normative property on the natural good. Why and how is it able to do that? Hutcheson, for example, made his audience discontented because he offered us no explanation of the existence of the moral sense. It's just something we have, presumably given to us by God. Hume tried to remedy this by presenting us with an account of the principles of human psychology that is designed in part to show us why the sentiments of approval and disapproval would inevitably arise and have an influence on conduct in creatures like ourselves, that is, creatures with our kinds of psychology. He tried to show us that approval and disapproval could be derived from general psychological principles. So no God-given moral sense is needed to explain these sentiments. But that still leaves us with an open question about whether the moral sentiments and their influence on our conduct are things that once we understand them, we ourselves should endorse. Pufendorf's version of this problem, the problem of explaining how something is able to confer a normative property on the natural good, his version of this problem is to explain the authority of the laws. If it's a law that makes an action obligatory, what makes it obligatory to obey the law? Pufendorf thought that the authority of the laws themselves must ultimately be traced back to the authority of God, which he thought could be explained in turn by the position in which God stands to us. God is better able to direct our conduct than we're able to direct it ourselves, and he's also capable of imposing sanctions upon us. These two properties together, Pufendorf believed, constitute authority. Kant, who in many ways was the most direct successor to Pufendorf, gave us a better solution to the problem of authority. He traced the authority of the law to autonomy, the authority that rational reflection gives us over ourselves. And it's that solution to which I now turn. Kant, like Pufendorf, thinks that moral entities are created when we make laws. In particular, he thinks it's moral legislation, the making of moral laws, that transforms what's merely naturally good into something that's morally good in the sense that we ought to pursue it. But for our purposes here, there's a better way to put the point. Recall that G.E. Moore showed us that it's impossible to get from the concept of what is good simply to any reasonable conception of what is good for this or that person. Now that we've established the existence of what is good for someone, by the arguments we've looked at before, we face the opposite problem: how to get from the notion of good for to the notion of good simply. Kant gives us an argument that shows us how that might be done. The argument is his argument for the formula of humanity, the principle that tells us to treat every human being as an end in itself. Now, before I explain how this works and how it's relevant to our topic, let me say something about terminology. When I want to say that something is good simply, as opposed to being good for someone, I'm now going to say that it's good absolutely, or good in the normative sense, just to keep the contrast in view. Now, remember that in my first lecture I claimed that good is our name for the solution of the problem of what to go for, what to aim at. I'm taking it that the notion of good simpliciter and the notion of what we should aim at are the same notion, and I will use good absolutely and good in the normative sense to remind you of that. In the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant announces that his view gives rise to what he calls a paradox of method. The paradox is, and I'm quoting, namely, that the concept of good and evil must not be determined before the moral law, for which, as it would seem, this concept would have to be made the basis, but only after it and by means of it. Here Kant asserts that the question what ends we should go for, the question of what's good absolutely or good in the normative sense, can only be settled by determining what ends it's right, that is, permissible or obligatory, to pursue. This suggests that Kant thinks that the way to move from the concept of what's good for someone to what's good absolutely is by asking whether it's right to pursue what's good for someone. And Kant calls this paradoxical because, as he says, we might have thought that the concepts of good and evil serve as the basis for making this decision. I think the paradox emerges more clearly if we put the point more squarely in terms of the contrast between good for and good absolutely. Suppose that the question, what I should aim at, was wholly answered for me by the fact that something's good for me. And the question, what you should go for, was wholly answered for you by the fact that something's good for you. Then each of us would have our own private absolute good. In a sense, we might think this is the way it is for the other animals. But since we're rational agents, that's not the way it is for us. What distinguishes rational agents, according to Kant, is the ability to reflect on the grounds of our beliefs and actions and to decide for ourselves whether those grounds count as reasons. So we can ask ourselves whether the fact that something would be good for ourselves, or indeed for someone else, is whether that fact is a reason to do it, whether it's being good for someone makes it the right thing to do. The paradox then is this: if we don't have a notion of good normatively or good absolutely to work with until after we've answered this question, what normative resources do we have for answering it? It seems natural to suppose that the way to answer the question whether it's right to do what's good for someone is by asking whether it's good absolutely, that we should do so. But according to Kant, you can't do it that way because you don't get the notion of good absolutely till you've answered the question about what's right. That's what Kant means when he says that we might have thought of the concepts of good and evil would serve as the basis of the moral law. Now, of course, we all know what Kant's way of handling the paradox is going to be. He's going to propose that the moral law is a formal principle, and that nevertheless we can derive moral content from it. We will get answers to questions about whether it's right to pursue what's good for someone by asking whether the maxims of actions that promote what's good for someone can be willed as universal laws. The question is how that solution gets on the table. Kant has a number of different ways of reaching this point in his argument. The one that most directly concerns us concerns the transformation of good for into absolute good. That argument is the argument for the formula of humanity. Now, before I explain what I mean by this, I want to point out that there's another way to look at the concept of the absolute good. I've claimed in my first lecture, or what I claimed in my first lecture combined with what I've claimed since, amounts to the claim that good for someone is a perspective-dependent entity. In general, good for is something that exists in the view of the living creatures who attend to their own well-functioning through action. What is good for me consists in the activities that constitute and promote my own well-functioning, as those activities are seen through my own eyes, at least when I myself am well-functioning. This does not mean, of course, that we can't form a conception of another person's good. What it does mean, interestingly, is that there's something essentially sympathetic about the second and third personal uses of good for. When I say that some activity or condition of things is good for you, I'm looking at that activity or condition in the way that I think that you, as a being who looks after his own well-functioning, necessarily sees it, or would see it if you were well-functioning. I share your point of view and look at the world through your eyes when I say that something is good for you. All of this suggests another way of thinking about the absolute good. The absolute good is that which is good from everyone's point of view. Now, of course, it's a substantial assumption that what's absolutely good in this sense is the same thing as what's absolutely good in the normative sense. That's an assumption that requires further justification, that what's absolutely good in this sense is what we should go for. What we should go for is what's good from everyone's point of view. The issue here is essentially the same one that I've elsewhere discussed under the heading of the publicity of reason. And I'm not going to say much more about the arguments in favor of it here. The idea that these two notions of absolute good are the same is plainly an assumption that Kant makes, because he says, and this is on the handout, what we are to call good must be an object of the faculty of desire in the judgment of every reasonable human being, and evil an object of aversion in the eyes of everyone. Now, what this means, of course, is not that everyone must want the same things that I do for themselves, but rather, if the fact that an end is good for me gives me a genuine reason for trying to make sure that I achieve it, then everyone else has a reason, although not necessarily an overriding one, to try to make sure that I achieve it as well. Roughly speaking, it means that one of Moore's two possible criteria for something's being good for me is met. Namely, that it's good absolutely, Moore would have said intrinsically, that I should have it. Kant also claims that when reason determines the will is the capacity to choose only that which it recognizes as good in this sense. So when we put these two things together, we see that Kant endorses the view that insofar as we are rational, we aim at ends that are good absolutely, good from everyone's point of view. Now, the argument for the formula of humanity, as Kant gives it in the groundwork, starts from the assumption that if there is such a thing as the moral law, there must be something of what Kant calls unconditional value, something that can serve as a ground of absolute laws, he says. Kant then dismisses several possible candidates, the objects of our inclinations, the inclinations themselves, and things found in nature, concluding apparently by elimination that what is of absolute value is humanity as an end in itself. Elsewhere, I've suggested that this argument should be reconstructed as something like an inquiry into what makes rational action possible. I've described it as a regress upon the conditions, but one might also take it, I think, as a transcendental argument, starting from the assumption that rational action is possible and asking how that could be so. So read, the argument starts from the assumption I've just mentioned, that when I choose an object rationally, I regard it as absolutely good. The question that it raises is, what makes it possible for me to view my ends in this way? We can then see Kant as dismissing several possible explanations. But the important one for our purposes is simply the first one that he dismisses. The first explanation that he dismisses is that what makes my action rational is that my end is one for which I have an inclination. Kant says, the ends that a rational being proposes at his discretion as effects of his actions are all only relative, for only their relation to a specially constituted faculty of desire gives them their worth. In other words, the objects of your inclinations, Kant is saying here, are only good for you. That's what he means by saying they're all only relative. They're only good for you. Now, according to the theory I've spelled out in these lectures, they'll be good for you if you are well-functioning, and you will take them to be so if you think that you are. Okay, so insofar as we're rational, we pursue an end only if we take it to be good absolutely. So we don't pursue the objects of our inclinations merely because we think those objects are good for us. And yet we certainly do pursue the objects of our inclinations, and we don't regard ourselves as irrational for doing so. Rational action seems to be possible. Furthermore, when we pursue our ends, we often expect others to help us, at least in small ways, or at least not to interfere without some important reason for doing so. In that sense, we show that we expect others to take our ends as ends for them as well. So all of that suggests that we take it to be absolutely good that we should get the things that are good for us, or those things that are good for those we care about. The question Kant raises is why we do that. And the answer he gives is, rational nature exists as an end in itself. The human being necessarily represents his own existence this way. That was a quote. We represent ourselves as ends in ourselves in the sense that we claim the status of absolute goodness for the things that are good for us. We claim that they're good just because they're good for us. It's as if when you made a choice, you said, I take the things that are important to me to be important, period. Important absolutely, because I take myself to be important. In the passage I just quoted, Kant says that the human being represents himself in this way. I take his meaning to be simply that if the assumptions he's making about the nature of rational action are correct, we have no option but to regard ourselves in this way. As reflective beings who are aware of the grounds of our beliefs and actions, and who therefore must act for reasons of some kind, we must take something to be reasons for our actions. And the only possible candidates, the only things that serve as incentives that we could adopt as reasons, are the things that are good for us, or of course, for others whom we care about. Okay, now we need another step. I just suggested that when Kant says we represent ourselves as ends in ourselves, what that amounts to is making a claim. We claim the status of absolute goodness for the things that are good for us. In order to understand the nature of this claim, we need to understand something else about Kant's conception of the nature of rational choice. And that is that in Kant's view, making a choice always amounts to making a law, at least for yourself. Choice by its very nature, Kant thinks, takes a universally prescriptive form. So here's why. Suppose I decide now that I'm going to grow my own vegetables in my garden this year. And suppose that a hypothetical imperative tells me that if I'm to grow my own vegetables in my garden, I must spend one afternoon every weekend this coming season weeding my garden. I only have free time on Saturday and Sunday afternoons, so that's when I must weed my garden, if the vegetables are not to be ousted by the weeds. Now, ordinarily, when we decide to do something in the future, we're aware that circumstances could arise, circumstances that would give us a good reason not to do it. So the commitment I make, expressed in my maxim, implicitly takes something like this form. I will weed my garden every weekend this season unless there's some good reason why not, in order to make the vegetables grow. Now, some of the good reasons why not may arise from conditions that make conforming to the maxim pointless. If a plague of locusts destroys my garden some week, eating up all the vegetables, there will be no good reason to keep weeding after that. But most good reasons are not like that. Most of them arise from changing circumstances that give me new motives. For example, a member of my family might become ill, and it might fall to my lot to care for this person on the weekends. Since I think this is more important than growing my own vegetables, I decide just to let the garden go, and I don't keep weeding it. I haven't violated my commitment because my commitment implicitly took the form that I would weed unless there was a good reason why not. Now, more generally, it's true that at any given moment when we choose something, we have what I will call a certain motivational profile. That is to say, we have a set of desires and interests, or in Kant's language, incentives, which are capable of moving us to do various things. And we decide that taking everything into consideration, this is what we most want to do. But we do that knowing that our motivational profile will change. Our motivational profile is always changing as we move through time, just as our theoretical view of the world is always changing as we move through space. Now, suppose that when I decide to grow vegetables in my garden, I decide that any change in my motivational profile, any change whatever, counts as a good reason to change my mind, counts as a good reason not to weed. In that case, if I wake up one Saturday morning and I decide I just don't feel like weeding the filthy garden this weekend, for any reason whatever, that will be a good reason to change my mind. The trouble is that if my commitment takes this form, I have not really willed anything. I have committed myself to nothing, since I'm only going to weed my garden if that happens to be what I most want to do. So the situation is this. Right now, I am subject to a certain set of potentially motivating factors, incentives. I have a certain motivational profile. What I've just said is that some of those incentives can count as good reasons for failing to will my garden, but not all of them can. And that means that my commitment to weeding my garden has a certain kind of universal normative force. It holds over a range of possible different cases, namely all of the cases in which my motivational profile is different, but I still have good reason to weed my garden. So when I choose to grow vegetables as my end, I bind myself to a future project of regular weeding by a law that is not completely conditional on my future self's desires. In that sense, I have legislated a categorical imperative for myself. And of course, my future self in turn also binds me, because it's essential if she's going to do the necessary weeding that I should now buy some pads to protect her need, some tools for her to weed with. And I must do that whether I feel like it or not. In this simple sense, whenever I make a choice, I impose obligations on myself, and whenever I make a choice, I make a law for myself. Choice takes the form of making a law. Now, with that in place, we can see what the representation of yourself as an end in yourself amounts to. It's a representation of yourself as having a certain kind of normative standing. When you choose what you take to be good for yourself, you make a law for yourself. But if it's also true that you take your ends to be good absolutely, then you're representing yourself as having a more extensive kind of normative standing. You're representing yourself as having the right to make laws for others, for everyone. Kant also thinks that we must grant that because others who claim normative standing on the very same ground, because others do claim normative standing on the very same ground, we must grant that they have a right to make laws for us, just as we have the right to make laws for them. And that in turn places a limitation on what we can legislate in the name of our own good. It must be compatible with the good of others. That's why Kant thinks that representing ourselves as ends in ourselves amounts to representing ourselves as legislators in the kingdom of ends, a world in which all rational beings participate together in the legislation of the good. Now, let me just clarify one point about this argument. Earlier I said that the sense in which we represent ourselves as ends in ourselves is that we claim the status of absolute goodness for the things that are good for us. I've been using the word representation because it's the translation of one that Kant uses. But I think in a way it's misleading. I've now argued that the sense in which we represent ourselves is that we make a claim for ourselves, a claim to a kind of normative standing. The sense in which there's a claim here is ambiguous. Claims may be theoretical or practical. A theoretical claim is an assertion that something is the case. A practical claim is an effort to make something the case. In the theoretical sense, I might claim that I'm the direct descendant of a notorious Viking. In the practical sense, I might claim a piece of unowned land for my property. In which sense do we claim this normative standing in Kant's theory? Representation makes it sound like a theoretical claim, but I think that's not right. In any case, we're doing natural history here and assuming that the world we live in is fundamentally the one that the natural sciences describe to us. In that world, there are no theoretical facts around to be represented about who has normative standing and who doesn't. If there were, they would have to be some sort of fundamental normative metaphysical facts of the kind that, following Kant, I'm rejecting. So the claim here is to be understood as a practical claim. Claiming normative standing is something that we do. It's something that we have to do in order to act rationally. Practical rationality really is, for Kant, rationality in action. And it follows from that morality, in a way, is something that we do, not something we know about and apply to our conduct. Morality exists because practically rational beings necessarily make claims on themselves and each other. And that is part of the way that as rational beings, we function. It's the way that we human beings try to realize what is good for us. Rational beings function by legislating that what is good for us shall be taken as absolutely good. And we do that when we form the kingdom of ends. Okay, that's Kant's argument, as I understand it, but I think it's not quite right. Kant's argument had another implication, I believe, one that he didn't see. Obviously, it's only rational beings who need to claim a normative standing in order to act, because this is only needed in order to act rationally. But it doesn't follow that your claim to normative standing is made only on behalf of yourself, considered as a rational being. The content of the claim is not automatically given by the fact that it's rational beings who make it. Now, this becomes clear, or the implications of this becomes clear, when we realize that there are actually two slightly different senses in which, to put it in Kant's language, we take ourselves to have normative standing when we make choices. We claim to have normative standing insofar as we take the things that are good for us to be good absolutely, and we claim to have normative standing insofar as we take our choices to have the status of laws for others. These two claims are very close, because to demand that an end be treated as good absolutely is just to demand that everyone treat it as giving them reasons, and in that sense to make a law for everyone. But there's still a difference when we consider how these claims operate on ourselves. Suppose that I choose some ordinary object of inclination, something that I take to be good for me. Here it will help to keep in mind that the good for people includes choosing our own conception of the good. In making this choice, I make certain demands on others. They should respect my autonomy, my status as legislator in the kingdom of ends, by respecting my choice. It's part of my good to choose my own conception of the good. They should not interfere with my acting as my choose, and many other things being equal, they should help me to get what's good for me if I am in need. But all of those restrictions operate, as it were, after the choice is made, after I have made a law. And if Kant is right, it's insofar as I am rational, I must choose something I take to be absolutely good, and yet the objects of my inclinations are only good for me, then I also claim to have a normative standing simply by taking the objects of my inclinations to be absolutely good. When I claim that what is important to me is important absolutely because I'm important, and on that basis decide to act, I make a demand that is addressed in the first instance to myself, to treat the things that are absolutely good, to treat the things that are good for me as if they were good absolutely. Now, that demand cannot be understood as a demand that my autonomy should be respected. Certainly on Kant's view, there is a sense in which you can respect your own autonomy. You can obey the laws you've laid down for yourself. For instance, when I weed my garden, even on a Saturday when I don't feel like it, I'm respecting my own autonomy in that I'm obeying a law that I made for myself. But my own original decision to choose or will some desired end is not motivated by respect for my own autonomy in that sense. I can't respect my choice or do what's necessary to carry it out until after I've made the choice. So the sense in which I claim a standing as an end in itself when I make the original choice is not exhausted by the idea that I respect my own autonomy in the sense of taking my choice to be a law. Respect for my autonomous nature doesn't explain the content of this choice. When I make the original choice, I have no other ground for taking my end to be good absolutely than that it's good for me. That's good for me, I say, and at least to the extent that it's compatible with good of others, we're all going to treat it as a good. This suggests that the pertinent fact about me, the ground on which I claim normative standing, is simply that I am the sort of being for whom things can be good or bad. I claim normative standing insofar as I'm an animal. Now, of course, someone might insist that I respect my own autonomy in a different sense in making this choice, not in the sense that I treat my own choice as a law, but in the sense that I claim that what is good for autonomous rational beings, and only for autonomous rational beings, is to be treated as good absolutely. But that conclusion is certainly not driven by the argument. There's no reason to think that because it is only autonomous rational beings who must make a normative claim, the normative claim is only about the standing of autonomous rational beings. And of course, many of the things that I do in fact take to be good for me are not good for me merely insofar as I'm an autonomous rational being. Food, sex, comfort, freedom from pain and fear are all things that are good for me insofar as I'm an animate being. So it's more natural to think that that part of the normative claim, the part of the normative claim involved in rational choice, is the things that are good for beings for whom things can be good or bad are to be treated as good or bad absolutely. But that includes things that are good or bad for the other animals. We might put the point this way. As rational beings, we need to justify our actions. We need to think that there are reasons for them. That requires us to suppose that some ends are worth pursuing absolutely, are absolutely good. Without metaphysical insight into a realm of intrinsic values, all we have to go on is that some things are certainly good or bad for the creatures around us and us. That then is the starting point from which we build up our system of values. We take those things, the things that are good or bad for creatures, to be good or bad absolutely, and we claim the authority to legislate that they are so. In doing both of those things, we're taking ourselves to be ends in ourselves. But we're not the only beings for whom things can be good or bad. The other animals are no different from us in that respect. It follows that in that sense of end in itself, all of the animals who have final goods should be treated as ends in themselves. Now, if the story I've just told explains why there's such a thing as the good, the absolute good, then it also has important consequences for what we understand, for how we understand what actually is good. And now, of course, I do mean absolutely good. I haven't been able to defend all the details of the Kantian story today, but if he's right, we can only rationally take something to be good for ourselves if we think it's good that we should have it from everyone's point of view. Or at least we can only rationally pursue it on those grounds. To that extent, as I said before, one of G.E. Moore's suggestions turns out to be true. Something is good for me only if it's good that I should have it. But it is not, as Moore meant to imply, that it is good for me only because it is good that I should have it. The dependence goes the other way. It is good that I should have it because it is good for me. This has an important implication, which is that nothing can ever be good unless it is good for someone. There is no such thing as an impersonal good, and because of that, goods cannot be aggregated. Because we have intuitions that seem opposed to these conclusions, I want to discuss them a bit. Certainly many philosophers think that things can be good or bad without being good or bad for anyone or anything in particular. They think, for instance, that the world is a better place if it's full of happy people and animals than if it has no inhabitants at all, or only miserable ones. Or they think that it's better if wealth is distributed more equally than if some people are very rich and some very poor. If things like this are true, you might suppose that there must be what are sometimes called impersonal goods. Then you'll probably think it's important that such goods should be realized, even though there's no one for whom they're good. Now, what I've just said might seem a bit puzzling. Isn't it better if the world is full of happy people and animals because it's better for those people and animals? And isn't it better if wealth is distributed equally because it's better for the people who would otherwise be poor? The trouble with the first of those claims, that the world is better if it's full of happy people and animals, is that it's unclear that the world would be worse for those people and animals if they didn't exist at all. Are all of the people and animals who never existed and never will in an unfortunate condition? Is that a bad thing for them? What a miserable world the place must be, miserable world this must be if that's the case. But surely, you reply, it's better if the world is full of happy people and animals than of miserable ones. But for whom is it better? If we're comparing two worlds containing the same inhabitants, in one of which those inhabitants are miserable, and in one of which they're happy, the second world is clearly better for them. But suppose we're not comparing two worlds with the same inhabitants. If you are miserable, would it be better for you if you were to be replaced by someone who's not? As for the second claim, of course it's better for the people who would otherwise be poor if wealth were distributed more equally, but by the same token, it would be worse for the people who would otherwise be rich. So it seems difficult to explain why we're tempted to think that a world full of happiness is better than a world full of misery, or that equitable distributions of wealth are better than lopsided ones, if we hang on to the idea that things are only good or bad because they're good or bad for someone. On the other hand, it seems strange to suppose that these sorts of things do matter if there's no one to whom they matter. Now, one way to approach the problem of the two universes would be to try to make it out that the universe itself is the kind of agent for whom things can be good or bad. Then perhaps it is better for the universe. It's full of happy people and animals than if it's full of miserable ones. But obviously there are some difficulties there. One is that even if we did think so, it's not really clear why it would be better for the universe to be full of happy people and animals, unless we think it functions by supporting happy life. More importantly, though, when we have the thought that the universe full of miserable life is not as good as the universe full of happy life, it's not because we're sympathizing with the universe. It's because we're sympathizing with the people and the animals who are in the universe, and we find the thought of their happiness pleasing and the thought of their misery displeasing. In fact, that in itself is already part of the explanation of why we tend to think the universe full of happy life is better. For as I've already mentioned, on the account of the good that I've given, sympathy plays an important role in the way the concept functions. But it's not that we're pleased when we sympathize with the happy people and animals because we believe, independently of sympathy, that their happiness is a good thing. If we believed that, we could be pleased by it without the aid of sympathy. Rather, they necessarily regard their happiness, or more properly, the conditions that constitute it, as something to go for, as an end to be sought. And when we sympathize with them, when we take up their point of view, we regard it that way too. And that's why we see it as good. Now, the larger point I'm trying to make here is that we cannot completely divorce thoughts about the good from thoughts about what to go for. When we talk about what's good for someone else, we're thinking about what to go for from his point of view. And that's not surprising, given that the original home of the concept of the good is, so to speak, in the deliberative perspective. This is why I asked you to keep in mind a while ago that the way in which the problems named by the right and the good are interlocking problems. because I think we'll find the answer to the question we're now asking in that fact. When we think about the comparison between the goodness of the two universes, it's impossible not to import thoughts about which of the two we would bring into existence if we were in the position of the creator and therefore faced with the choice. If we were, I think we all agree that we would certainly bring into existence the universe full of happy people and animals if we could. But that's not because it contains more happiness, and happiness is impersonally good. It's because if you are the creator, then it is right, that is, it's your duty, to do as well as you can for whoever you create. The universe full of happy people and animals is not exactly more worthy of choice because it's better. Rather, it's better because it's more worthy of choice. But this is not to say that there's no one for whom it's better, and that no thought of the good guides the choice. The happier universe is better for whoever gets created. But in order to explain why whoever gets created is the right way to single out the beneficiary of this choice, we have to appeal to the deliberative context in which the choice is made, including any duties that are inherent in that deliberative context. A more down-to-earth example will help. When we're deciding to have children or enacting legislation that will affect the population, we are also in the position of the creator. That's why it makes perfect sense to say, for instance, that it will be better to have a child later when you're in better circumstances, even though there is no genetically identifiable child for whom that's better. Of course, you have different children. There's no one we can pick out as a genetically individual and say that's better for you. But your duty as a prospective parent is to do as well as you can for whatever children you have, not for some genetically identifiable individual who does not yet exist and may never do so. Now, there are two things to say about the other case I mentioned, that of equal distributions. The first one is modeled on exactly what I just said about the two universes. More equitable distributions, like universes full of happy people and animals, are better because they're more worthy of choice in the context in which one chooses a system of distribution, which is when one is setting up the basic structure of society. In order to learn why the more equitable distribution is more worthy of choice, all you have to do now is read John Rawls's theory of justice to find out why in these circumstances a more equitable distribution is the one that would be chosen. In fact, the reason I keep using more equitable rather than equal is because I think Rawls's difference principle is superior to a strictly egalitarian one, as I will explain presently. Now, Rawls, of course, imagines that we're choosing the principles of justice that will govern our distributive institutions in what he calls the original position, in which none of us knows what place we will actually hold in society, and each of us is eager to choose the distributive scheme that will be as good as possible for himself. Here, as in the case of the two universes, the choice is governed by thoughts about what is better for someone. But it's not governed by thoughts about what's better for genetically identifiable individuals. The parties in the original position make the choice by asking what, under the veil of ignorance, will be better for themselves. But that's only a step along the way. The more important point is that those who enter into the original position undertake to make the choice in a way that will be best for a citizen of a liberal society considered merely as such. The context of choice explains why that is the beneficiary we should be thinking of in this kind of case. Now, the other thing to say in this case is that the political state, unlike the universe, really is a kind of agent. Indeed, according to some of my own arguments in self-constitution, it's a self-constituting agent. We might think there are all kinds of ways in which the state, considered merely as such, does indeed function better if there are more equitable distributions. More equitable distributions support a middle class with all of the benefits to stability and culture that a middle class is supposed to provide. In the end, I think this explanation comes to the same thing, though. The benefits of stability and culture ultimately accrue to the citizen considered as such. In both arguments, the beneficiary of the state is the representative citizen, and we look to what is good for her. But the reason we do so is because it's to her that the arrangements of the state must be justified, and not to some genetically identifiable individual. The state has no good of its own that is not the good of the representative citizen. Now, that's not to say that there are not other kinds of collective agents that do have such a good, corporations or universities or clubs. But it's a particularly important point to make about the state. The state's interests can come into conflict with yours, considering you as a private individual, as a genetically identifiable individual. But it cannot come into conflict with yours, considering you as a representative citizen. That there should be occasion to sacrifice the citizen for the good of the state is, I believe, a logical impossibility. Okay, now let's turn to aggregation. Some utilitarians like to believe that their view is compatible with the thought that everything that's good is good for someone, because they think that each of the goods that they throw into the calculation is good for someone. But the idea that everything that is good for someone is incompatible with aggregation, because what's good for me plus what's good for you is not, taken just like that, good for anyone in particular, and therefore is not good. The aggregate good, if the idea made any sense at all, would have to be an impersonal good. As Rawls himself famously pointed out, utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between persons. I've already said what goes wrong in the case of hedonistic utilitarians. Pleasure is a relational notion, not something we can detach from its owner and add to someone else's pleasure. But this gives rise to a question about what we're to do with those of our intuitions that seem to favor the idea of aggregation. Aren't there cases in which we plainly choose actions because they do more good, even when more than one person's good is involved? Obviously, I can't give a complete treatment of this difficult subject here, but it's worth noting that it still seems to be intelligible, consistently with the idea that what's good or bad must be good or bad for someone in particular, to claim that we do more good in two kinds of cases that do involve more than one person, or I'll now add, more than one agent of any kind. First of all, it looks as if we can still say that we do more good by choosing a course of action that benefits additional subjects, so long as no one is harmed by that course of action. This thought covers the simple case of saving 2 lives in preference to saving 1, for example. Second, it seems intelligible to claim that we do more good by giving a resource to a subject who will benefit from it the most, so long as no one has a prior claim on the resource, and so we are not harming the other subjects among whom we're choosing. This thought would cover the case, for example, where we think we do more good by giving a painkiller to the subject who's in the most pain. What most obviously becomes unintelligible on the view that good and badness are always good and badness for someone is the idea that we can do more good by balancing the good of one subject against the good of another. Say by taking pleasure away from Jack, because that way we can give an even greater pleasure to Jill. That's simply good for Jill, but bad for Jack. And if goodness or badness must be good or badness for someone, that's all there is to say. There is no one for whom that situation is better overall, and therefore no sense in which it's better. Now, one interesting thing about these points is that they coincide with an idea that plays an important role in Rawls's own account of the right, namely the legitimacy of making moves that are, in economist jargon, Pareto optimal, moves that leave everyone better off and no one worse off. According to Rawls, the first thought that would naturally occur to us in the original position is that we should distribute everything equally. But then we realized that an unequal distribution is preferable if it would make everyone better off. No matter who we turn out to be, we will be better off that way. That move is a Pareto optimal move. In fact, as Rawls points out, every arrangement of the basic structure of society that maximizes distributive shares according to one of the representative positions in society, say for simplicity, the worst off, the middle class, and the best off, every distribution that maximizes that class's share of primary goods is a Pareto optimal solution. You can't move away from it without making someone worse off. For complicated reasons, which I won't rehearse here, Rawls thinks we will choose the distributive principle of making those who are worse off as well off as they possibly can be, the so-called difference principle. Now, notice that the move from equality to a position that makes someone better off without making anyone worse off is licensed by the first of the two thoughts I mentioned, that it makes sense to aggregate goods across the boundaries between persons when we're just adding goods and not subtracting. And among all the possible Pareto optimal positions, the choice of that as the worst off, as the one with respect to which we should maximize, is licensed by the second thought I mentioned, that when we're distributing a resource to which no one has a prior claim, we do more good by giving it to the one to whom it will do the most good. Thus, in both of the two senses of doing more good that remain to a theory of the good that insists that everything that's good must be good for someone, the distribution that accords with the difference principle is better, that it does more good than any other. That is not what makes it right. It's right because the parties in the original position would choose it. But it's why they would choose it, because their ignorance of their own positions forces them to choose a principle that is not just good for themselves, but is in the absolute or normative sense good. Now, I've portrayed these ideas as if I were suggesting that the idea that everything is good must be good for someone limits us to a kind of lopsided form of aggregation. We're allowed to add, but only when that doesn't involve subtraction. But there's a much better way to think about what's going on here. Earlier I said that since good is a perspective-dependent notion, a natural way to think of the absolute good is that the absolute good is that which is good from everyone's perspective. In other words, in place of aggregation, we put the ideal of shareability. The absolute good is the thing that is good for all of us because it's good for each of us, or at least good for lots of us and not bad for any of us, the common good. It is the aim of action that everyone can accept and no one can object to. It's the good that all of us can share. So we put that in place of the notion of adding goods. Now, I've just reached two conclusions. First, as reflective animals, we can see that our only reason for claiming that our ends are absolutely good is that they're good for us. And if our own ends are absolutely good only because they're good for us, not for any deep metaphysical reason having to do with the special value of human beings, then we must in reason grant that the ends of any animal for whom things can be good or bad should be regarded as good too. The other animals matter morally because things can be good or bad for them. And the only reason why we matter morally is that things can be good or bad for us. Second, I've claimed that the absolute good, the ultimate good that we should strive for, is the shareable good. These conclusions are, in my own view, good news for Kantian ethics, but they are bad news for the good. Because life preys on life, life feeds on life, life demands death. And that means that there is no state of affairs that is good for everyone. It's impossible. The absolute good cannot be achieved. In my last lecture, I said that when nature created animate beings who have a point of view of their own, she made a terrible error because she created entities who have a point of view from which they can criticize nature herself. I wasn't kidding. I'm saying it now. Nature is bad. The world is, by our human standards, a bad place. It's not a place in which it's possible ever to realize the good. The situation is not merely a misfortune, but almost a paradox. For on my view, it's life that creates value. Indeed, life almost is value on this view, and it's life that makes the achievement of the good impossible. Kant himself, although he didn't include the other animals within the scope of the good, envisioned an absolute good, a state of affairs he called the highest good, in which every person is virtuous and happy in proportion to his or her virtue. And Kant worried that if we thought we could never realize the highest good, we would be subject to moral despair and give up on morality itself. He thought we would conclude that, and I'm quoting now, if the highest good is impossible, then the moral law which commands us to promote it must be fantastic and directed to empty imaginary ends, and therefore must in itself be false. For different reasons than the ones that I've outlined, Kant thought that we cannot see how we can possibly realize the highest good, and this thought animates his philosophy of religion. Because the moral law commands necessarily, and we can't just give it up, Kant thought we're licensed to have faith that there are metaphysical forces behind the world of appearances that cooperate with our moral aspirations and help us to bring about the highest good. One way to envision how this might be so is if there's a God who will reward the virtuous with happiness, and we have an immortal life in which something like our own moral perfection can ultimately be achieved. As I say, for Kant, this was not because there's no way in which the world could be made ultimately good for all of its creatures. He didn't include the animals. On the contrary, Kant rather heartlessly wrote, and this is the long passage you may want to look on, in explaining his advocacy of practical faith. Consider the case of a righteous man who actively reveres the moral law, but who remains firmly convinced that there is no God and no future life. He does not require that complying with the law should bring him an advantage, either in this world or in another. Rather, he's unselfish and only wants to bring about the good to which that sacred law devotes all his forces. Yet his efforts encounter limits, for while he can expect that nature will now and then cooperate contingently with the purpose that he feels obligated to achieve, he can never expect nature to harmonize with it in a way governed by laws and permanent rules. Deceit, violence, and envy will always be rife around him, even though he himself is honest, peaceable, and benevolent. Moreover, as concerns the other righteous people he meets, no matter how worthy of happiness they may be, nature, which pays no attention to all that, will still subject them to all the evils of deprivation, disease, and ultimately death, just like all the other animals of the earth. And they will stay subjected to these evils always until one vast tomb engulfs them all, honest or not, it makes no difference here, and hurls them back, they who managed to believe they were the final purpose of creation, back into the abyss of purposeless chaos matter from which they were taken. And so this well-meaning person would indeed have to give up as impossible that purpose that the moral law obligated him to have before his eyes. If we don't believe in God and immortality, Kant thought, then we must believe ourselves subject to the same harsh fate as all the other animals of the earth, to be thrown back into the purposeless chaos of matter from which we came. Mostly I'm with Kant, but not in this. It's life that gives us the standard of the good, because it's conscious life, life that's conscious of itself, that makes it true that things can be good or bad for us. And it's our own affirmation of life that gives us the standard of the right when we legislate that what's good for us is worthy of achievement and should be realized. Our moral aspirations and their ultimate hopelessness have a common source in our own ephemeral nature. The good did emerge, along with life, from the purposeless chaos of matter, and it is destined, like us, to be hurled back into it. But the good and the right are our standards, the standards that make humanity what it is, and to abandon them would be a self-inflicted death. It's not only that it's right to try to make the world as good as possible for all of its creatures, because of our moral nature, doing that is also what is good for us. Thank you.
So, in a sense, what you're telling us now is that you are somehow understanding the good simplicity in terms of the good for everyone. No? And so here's an example that I tried recently on some colleagues in St. Andrews. So suppose you're witnessing a sort of tennis game, no? Between, on the one hand, Murray and Federer, no? And Murray is playing injured, so he's losing his tennis game. And I think most people would say that this fact was bad for him, no? And it was good for Federer in a sense, no? I think many intuitively would say something like that. But they would also probably want to say that the tennis match in itself was bad, period. At least I would be inclined to say that, no? Now, one reason why I would be inclined to say that, or rather, when I suggested this, many people would reacted in, or not many, but some British people reacted in a way that I hadn't expected. They were saying something like, yeah, but surely what that means is that it's bad for the game. And I think that that's possible, one possible answer, but it's actually consistent with me saying that, yeah, but nonetheless, it's still bad, period, in the sense that it's unjust that the game is finished in this way. Now, the way you're using good for and bad for and good period here, I wonder what would you say about a case like that? Because it involves a sort of comparative, or close to what you had been saying about comparative. But if you, for instance, say that when the way to understand bad here is that it's bad for everyone, I think maybe Murray would say, no, it's, or Federer would say, yeah, no, I don't agree. It's actually good for me.
Well, I don't follow tennis, so I'm not familiar with the specifics of your case here. In general, you may have noticed yesterday, I actually put organized sports into my list of the ways that human beings function. I take it that legitimate competitive activities actually serve the function of producing a good play of the game, a form of excellence that people enjoy and admire and aspire to. And that means that what's best in a given game is sort of that the best person win. That's good for everyone because it's good for the game. So that's how I think about those kinds of cases. Okay. It also follows, of course, from that way of thinking about things, that an athlete, like other people who engage in competitive activities, is asked to be, in an extravagant sense, a grown-up, because you have to think in every case that what's important is that you played as well as you could and not whether you won or lost. Pretty hard to do, but that's the attitude that's called for.
But, okay, rephrasing. So if I put pressure on the fact that it's something unjust, would you also understand injustice as a sort of two-place predicate? I mean, would it also be understood basically in terms of something being bad for or
Yes, I think, I mean, that was part of my point about, I mean, this is a different kind of injustice, but part of the point about Rawls and the distributive system is that when you are setting up a system of justice, the proper way to think of who what you do should be good for is to think of the representative citizen. So it's not always sort of real genetically identifiable people that we think of as good for when we think of these kinds of cases, because we're always thinking good for, always. By good for, you mean the sort of thing you should go for. And the state of affairs in which you go for a system of justice is the original position. So from the original position, you look for something that's good for the representative citizen as such.
So I was thinking about the argument you had that if you assume that if something is good, then it has to be good for someone, and if it's better, then it has to be better for someone, then this would make aggregation impossible. And in a way, I think that I share your view here, but it's difficult to express the view, because let's take the example that you had. So suppose we take something from one person, so that person suffers a loss, and we create a greater gain for another person, right? On the aggregative views, this would be a better solution, a better world, right? Now, this world, is it better for someone? Yes, of course, the answer is yes, of course, for the person who got the gain, right? The problem is that if we gave the smaller gain for the other guy and the bigger gain, loss for the first guy, it would still be better for someone, right? The person who gained. So it's not simply this condition that something cannot be better if it's not better than for someone that is doing the job here, stopping the aggregation. There must be something else, because this condition is trivially satisfied, right? As long as there is someone who profits on the change, right?
Well, right. And this was in the context of having said that we're supposed to go for things that are good from everyone's point of view.
Yeah, well, if we go for that, but that would be the next step, right? But so one could say, well, what's the problem with aggregation is that we want that something is good because only good if it's good for everyone. But that was something that you didn't assume at this stage of the argument, right? You said that there's some problem with aggregation already on the basis of this principle that goodness has always been goodness for someone,
but,
right?
It's supposed to work with better and worse, too.
Yes, better and worse, too, exactly. So something cannot be better if it's not better for someone. Mm-hmm. So this principle is trivially satisfied by those aggregation cases because there's someone who profits, right?
Well, it's better for someone, but it's worse for someone else.
Yes, that's
so
true.
Nothing is settled about what we should do by that consideration.
Right, so it cannot be simply the principle that nothing can be better if it's not better for someone, because this principle is satisfied by the aggregation, right?
Okay, then it should be enough that we're assuming that the good is what to go for, because the question what to go for isn't settled for a reflective creature merely by the fact that it's better for someone because it's also worse for someone.
Yes, but then of course this issue, that's another issue. I mean, I'm not sure that the question what to go for is settled by the issue whether this is better for anyone. Certain things may be something to go for without being better for anyone in particular, but that's kind of, I didn't want to bring this. So I simply wanted to point out that I share this feeling that there is some fundamental problem with aggregation, but I don't think that this can be attacked by this principle by the so-called personal restriction, right? Personal affecting restriction, saying that nothing can be better without being better for someone, because this restriction is very weak, unless you consider cases of non-identity problem cases, but those are all.
Well, I guess I was taking it that aggregation, people who are favoring aggregations also have a commitment in this thing, which is that they claim that what they're doing is better overall and not just better for someone.
Well, it's better overall, and then it's better overall, but it cannot be better overall without being better for someone. That's the position of welfarists, right, who are doing the aggregation.
Right, but aggregation, I mean, the attempt to aggregate would have no teeth at all if any way you shifted things around, would be better for someone.
I agree. So it's not, so the problem is that this principle, the person affecting restriction, only formulates a necessary condition for betterness. And as a necessary condition, it's a very weak condition. But what one needs is some kind of sufficient condition for betterness that would say, well, certain changes, right, they are better for some people, but of course what you get is not better at all, right? Not better overall. The welfarists would agree to that, right? Yes. So, but it's not easy to formulate this sufficient condition unless you go for what you suggested, that it has to be better for everyone, which is a very strong view, right? Do you really?
I see your point.
Yeah.
It seems to me a little bit, I don't quite know how to formulate this response, as if your imagined aggregationist is sort of slipping between different accounts.
Yes.
In making this
Exactly.
objection, is sort of shifting between the different accounts of good absolutely himself,
Right.
in order to get the result that he wants.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for a very engaging and interesting lecture. I should add that my discipline is history, not philosophy, so I have to excuse myself. But in particular, I really liked your message. The definition of the ultimate good as something which is good from the point of view of everyone. And also the other part of your message, so to speak, that we should really try to do the best also for other creatures than human beings. So, but I have two questions then, because being a historian, I've nevertheless written about virtues and about the antiquity and friendship and so on, thus coming into Aristotle. And as you know, he deals with the ultimate good as well. And his definition of the ultimate good in the Nicomachean ethic is that it is happiness. But then he comes out with a kind of almost circular argument, because in the end, who is happy? Well, the person, according to his view, who is acting in accordance with virtues. So the ultimate good comes out as happiness. Happiness is a right behavior, so to speak, a normative action. So that's my first question. I don't know what you say about that. How you would refer his argument to Kant and your own. The other question is, with this definition that you would like to push, that one should really include also other creatures than human beings, what do you say about human rights? As a discipline of arguing really to exclude other persons than human beings with a normative capacity, rational capacity, and so on.
Okay, thank you. As to your first question here, I think there's an interpretive issue about the Nicomachean ethics, and as to whether it gives rise to a circle of the kind you describe or not. I read the Nicomachean ethics in a quite particular way. Plato and Aristotle take it to be definitive that a virtue is a quality that makes you good at performing your function. Aristotle also says the function of a human being is to live rationally. Rationality is the function of a human being. So that should mean that virtues are qualities that may enable you to perform the function of living rationally well. Virtues should make you good at rational choice. Now, I take it that much of the project of the Nicomachean ethics is to take the stuff that ordinary people call virtues and to show how that might make you good at rational choice. Because it's not obvious how being courageous and temperance and all that. But I take it the project is to show that, and to show it through a rather elaborate moral psychology as to how the virtues affect our perceptions of what's good and bad for us. And in that case, I think you don't end up with a circular argument. You end up with an argument that shows that virtue in the ordinary sense is virtue in the technical sense, and therefore that it's legitimate to think it's what will make you function well and what will make you happy. So that's the interpretive move I would take in response to your
because I noticed that you used the word not exactly happiness, but when you talked a bit about we would be happy and the happy world and so on, according to this philosophical rules, so to speak. But you didn't really take up happiness as a kind of theoretical concept, so to speak, which actually Aristotle does.
Yes, I think his conception of happiness is more a conception of being a well-functioning being,
yes,
in his sense of function, and I have talked about that a bit in earlier lectures in the series. Now, as far as human rights are concerned, and the question of the other animals, I mentioned when I was explaining the two senses in which, in Kant's argument, it seems to me you claim standing as an end in yourself. One is you claim standing to be able to make laws for everyone, and the other is just you claim my good is valuable just because I'm the kind of creature for whom things can be good. And I also mentioned that I think it's a specific feature of human beings that we work out our own conception of the good. I talked a bit about how that could be true yesterday. Now, this means that human beings have a specific set of rights which are concerned with the preservation of their autonomy and have to do with preserving each human being's right to live by his or her own conception of the good. Familiar kind of thought in the liberal tradition. So there's sort of autonomy-based rights based on that thought. Whether in a Kantian conception, the other way of being an end in yourself, being someone whose good is valuable just because you're the kind of creature for whom things can be good, is a complicated question because Kant is inclined to think that all rights are autonomy-based rights. Now, I haven't worked out all the details of this position yet. It's one of the things I'm working on now. I think one of the reasons why people think that the idea of animal rights is ridiculous is because it would certainly be bizarre to think that we are going to enforce the rights of some animals against the rights of others. You know, like there's some people who think if you believe in animal rights, you have to think that human beings should be out trying to prevent predation, like we should be out trying to prevent murder. And that just seems absurd to people, and it also seems false, so that we should be trying to mess with the natural world in that particular way. I don't think that the sense in which you might get something like political standing for the claims of animals is going to look like in a finished argument. I think what it's going to look like is more like this. We have a certain set of rights because together we formed a kind of community. There are animals that interact with us sort of in a way that makes them subject to that community. Animals are like a subject population, not like members of the community, but kind of like a potential slave state. We hold complete power over them, and that's not good. That gives them no way to enforce their claims. What's needed here is an argument that shows not that we should enforce protections again, of animals from each other, but that animals are, because they are a subject population, entitled to protection against the human community as such. So the idea would be to find a set of animal rights that shows why human beings need to enact laws that restrains human beings in their treatment of animals. So that would be a quite different structure of a political right than the kind that human beings have.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the former speaker, I would like to thank you for the very interesting ethical system that you have presenting during these 4 lectures. Now, my question is very simple and has to do with how to understand you. You relate yourself to Kant, and you did it today, but you never stressed his notion of reverence, Achtung. It's only in this last quotation where we have the righteous man who actively reveres the moral law. Now, well, to me, this is not just a kind of contingency in Kant's ethical system. It's very central, right or wrong, that's what I think. Now, is there in your system, can I in your system find simply a counterpart to Kant's notion of reverence or Achtung?
Achtung is the word that's translated respect in some contexts, and I did talk about respect, both for the law and for a person's autonomy in what I had to say today.
Okay.
So I take it there are two notions at work. One is a notion of respecting persons, which is respecting their normative standing as lawmakers. And then there is Kant's sort of semi-psychological use of Achtung as the incentive you have for obeying a law when you are the one who has made it. So,
Emotion, I would say.
sorry?
I would say that Kant regards Achtung as a kind of emotion, a self-created emotion.
It's certainly something with a necessarily affective dimension, yes. He describes how that is in the second critique in the chapter on the incentives of pure practical reason. I agree with that. Respect for law is an incentive we experience when we have the thought that something is required of us, and that thought by itself is able to move us to do it.
That's your view. Okay, but do you regard your notion of respect that you have been using as more or less the same as Kant's, or is that some kind of minor difference between your interpretation of his use and your own use of it?
Well, as I say, I think there are sort of two notions at work here, although related. One is sort of respect for the law itself, and then there's this respect for lawmakers. It's a funny thing, everyone sort of remembers Kant as the person who established the value of respect for persons. He says it occasionally, but mostly he talks about respect for law. And once in a while, he even says, when we respect persons, what we're really respecting is the law. I sort of think this kind of revisionist memory of him is better than what he says himself, that he is the one who established the value of respect for persons. It's just that I think there is also a sense, we respect persons as lawmakers, but I think we also need to respect all creatures as creatures for whom things can be good or bad.
Okay, so I have a question about the sort of latter parts and the sort of departure from Kant in not having the practical postulates. And I mean, what I didn't really understand is if we say that the good is impossible, I mean, and then say that we should make the world as good as possible. But I mean, if we don't achieve it, it's not good, right? I mean, if
shareability comes in degrees.
Yes, shareability comes in degree, but if absolute good requires this absolute shareability, then we won't ever achieve that. And that I sort of thought that the absolute good was to be sort of a cornerstone in the system, and we can't achieve it. So what's good about everything that falls below absolute good if it's impossible?
I suppose you could take me to be constructing a notion of better. The notion of good is usually supposed to be accompanied by a notion of better.
I mean, sure, but how? But on the other hand, you don't want aggregation. So what's this notion of better built from? Degrees falling below.
Degrees of shareability.
I mean, I guess you can say this, but it seems like a sort of substitute for the real thing. I mean, there's a sort of a, not just a difference of degree here, but really a difference in kind between that which we can achieve and that which we cannot achieve.
Since I don't share your intuition on this, I'm not knowing how to respond.
know if I have one or two questions, but first of all, I wonder what you have a notion about someone having a prior claim on a resource, and I wonder what what gives you that prior claim, and what I'm wondering about is that is it possible to ever pursue a human project if your theory is that you should, whatever you do, you shouldn't make a sentient being worse off? So my first question is that what gives you a prior claim? Do human beings have a prior claim on lands and so on? And my second question is it ever possible to build a road, build a building, or do anything if you shouldn't make a sentient being worse off by that project?
Okay, I don't have any fancy notion of prior claim involved. It's just the ordinary notion. I mentioned when I pointed out the ways in which Rawls's difference principle seemed to fit both of the criteria in which that I think remain, that you can sort of make things better for more than one person at a time. I mentioned that this makes it look as if the difference principle in a way chooses the best distribution, but that by itself isn't what makes it right. What makes it right is that it's the one that would be chosen in the original position. Now, of course, we're never in the original position, but we are in a position where we do make decisions together. And sometimes when we make decisions together, we decide to make them in a way that will make properly specified beneficiaries better off. If people agree to these kinds of changes, now I just mean in the usual democratic way, then that makes them legitimate. So it is an important point that what makes it right is not merely that it's better. What makes it right is that the relevant agent or groups of agents would choose it because it's better.
So it would be one thing to say, well, this is the theory of the right, but would you say that those solutions that are arrived at in original position are solutions that make the world better? Because those solutions, for example, involve raising the level of the worse off, right, but at the cost of diminishing the level of the better off, right? So there is this problem of aggregation. There are some people gain, other people lose, right? So, of course, the right people gain, those who are in the in the worst shape, right? But that's another matter. But as long as we cannot achieve this ideal that Johan was talking about, well, we need something like this is better than something else, right? And it relates to Dan's question. Well, certain solutions are better than others. But those better solutions, improvements, mean that some people get worsenings, right? That they are worse for some of us.
Well, I'm imagining a situation like this, and I take it this is the situation when we're making political decisions, that we have effectively gotten together and agreed with all of us that we're going to choose in a way that is better for the representative citizen as such, that that's what we're going to do.
And if we did agree, then it's better, just because we have agreed. That's the...
It's better because it's better for the correct beneficiary of this decision.
But it's worse for many people.
These people have agreed to be part of this decision.
Yeah, so I had two line of thoughts. The first one was related to Johan's point as well. So I also reacted to that, and I mean, it seemed a bit unsatisfactory to say that we should just do the best we can. It seems that you need some kind of moral psychology to be spelled out here, and for instance, how to react to others' non-compliance, and how should we, so some kind of non-ideal theory, given that the rough reality that we face. So, but maybe you don't need to say anything more about it. That was just a thought. A question in relation to the your mentioning of rules. So I was wondering, can there be cases where your duties as a citizen in this practical identity conflict with your duties as a human being?
Certainly there can be cases in which your duties as a citizen conflict with your duties as a human.
If so, which takes precedence? Which identity should you act on?
I think it would be surprising if there was a general answer to that question, which is not to say that there are not specific answers on specific occasions.
All right. Okay. Well, just because this matter of shareability came up, and I was actually very fond of that concept and the way you introduced it. I mean, this idea that the ultimate good is what we can share, shareability. And what struck me now, considering it, is that maybe it comes a bit close to a concept which has become increasingly popular within social sciences during recent years and in gender research, that is vulnerability. Do you have any opinion about that? I mean, because if you regard the world and human being and animals and so on as a vulnerable world and imperfect and vulnerable in different ways, this concept of shareability comes out as even more, I think, strong as a kind of a moral voice. Do you see my point? Or you are familiar with this concept of vulnerability?
Vulnerability?
Vulnerability, yes.
Yes. Well, certainly it's one of the problems with aggregative thinking is the way in which it seems to leave the individual vulnerable to group needs, and that seeming to be backwards because it seems more as if the group should be responsive to individual needs. So in that sense, I think they are related.
Well, first, thank you very much for an interesting lecture. I have one short question. Hopefully it's short anyway. You said that something is right, if I understood this the right way, if the relevant people or group of people choose this thing because it's better, it's shareable and better for this representative citizens. But does it have to be an actual choice of this from this group or these people? Can people choose the wrong thing? Maybe they have, for some reason, didn't choose the more shareable thing. Can they choose wrong? And is this actual choosing important? Maybe I missed this. Maybe you have already said this, but I don't know.
I haven't talked about that issue in these lectures at all because my focus has been in these lectures more on the good than the right, and I take that to be an important question, more about the right. I was bringing up the right today just to bring up how the right plays a role in getting us from good 4 Absolutely good. I do think the question you raised is an important one, and I've discussed it in the political parts of self-constitution under the heading of the problem of substantive and procedural conceptions of justice and how they work together and can come apart. So I don't think I'll try to repeat everything I said there here, but that's the place to look. I think the kind of issue you're talking about is a case of the conflict between substantive and procedural justice, because procedural justice demands that we live by a decision that we all make together. And something along the lines of what I've said today should give us a standard that you would expect us to be following when we all make decisions together. But of course, people don't always do that.